Olivia stood at the top of the wall and looked out over the sea of fire. "Explosives?" she whispered in shock. "And gasoline," said Taylor. Explosives alone wouldn't have been able to create such wide-ranging devastation. From this vantage point, Taylor could see that in addition to the explosives that had laced the trenches and bunkers, there was also a layer of liquid gasoline coating everything, spreading the fire much farther than the initial explosions. The wooden spikes that had been concealed under the ground were also completely ablaze. "Before long," said Charles in a calm, almost disinterested tone, "fire and gunpowder will have less and less of an effect on zombies and paranormals. We have to make sure we're making the most of these weapons while they're still effective." The others looked at him open-mouthed, shocked at how casually he was able to philosophize over such ruthless destruction. It was as though he were the devil himself. Alex gulped. "Sir," he said tentatively, "did you design this area with these traps in place? Were you planning for something like this all along?" "So this is the difference between Charles and the rest of us," muttered Robert under his breath, shaking his head. Below, they could see that more than 1,000 Stellar Technology soldiers had died in the explosion, while over 3,000 had been injured so badly that they clearly wouldn't fight again. But this was nothing compared to the losses they had sustained in the Sea of Fire itself. The great bulk of their army had advanced too far, trapping themselves in between the 3 gates that bound the Inferno. Even from up on the wall, the Alliance members could hear the Stellar Technology soldiers' screams of pain and fear, as one by one, they were consumed by the flames. Here and there, they could make out some water-type paranormals just managing to defend themselves, casting around in a frenzy for a means of escape. Recognizing the advantages that the paranormals had, some of the regular soldiers struggled to get close to them at any cost, but the paranormals quickly took them down with their ice blades. Olivia and her cohort were rendered speechless by the hellish suffering that surrounded them. They would hardly have believed such cruelty was possible if they weren't witnessing it with their own eyes. When the Dawn Alliance had first mapped out this territory, the deputy mayors had allowed Charles control over a huge area. Not only would he oversee the nearby farmland, but he would also take ownership of the central residential area that led toward the main gate. He had proceeded to fill this area with a wide array of military defenses, and he had instated a military base in the Light Gate, which stood between the Wind and Fire gates. The Alliance members had supported this, as it suited the merit system that had been put in place. The members received merit points at military bases to reward them for hard work and bravery in battle. They could then spend the points to buy food, water, and more powerful equipment. If they had enough merit points, they could even ask Charles to personally forge equipment for them. Under such a reward system, the people were very keen to build as many military bases as required. In addition, the deputy chiefs had ensured that each new member was trained in the proper use of the bases. As a result, the entire alliance was fully on board with them. Not even Olivia had ever questioned their presence or function. Back then, they had been ready to agree with any preparation that might help their chances against such a forbidding enemy as Stellar Technology. What they hadn't realized, though, was that Charles had booby-trapped the bases from the beginning. When no one else had been watching, he had planted the entire zone with a whole battery of explosives and flammables. It wasn't clear how he had set the explosives off, but each of the Alliance members could see how thoroughly he had rigged the area. They were gobsmacked to see how quickly the military base on which they had spent so much time and effort building and maintaining had been set ablaze. On the one hand, Charles's plan had succeeded. After all, his enemies were now dead or dying before them. On the other hand, though, the efficiency and heartlessness of the plan had cast a fear of their leader in every member of the Alliance. They couldn't help asking themselves what he might do if he were ever to turn on one of them. Had he set other traps intended for his followers? If so, did they have any way of surviving them or even detecting them? They couldn't imagine the possibility of ever finding themselves pitted against Charles and somehow winning. Watching the brutal manner in which Charles had taken care of his enemies, they individually arrived at the same conclusion, that they could never turn against him. It might be difficult to spend their days following him in fear, but it was clear that the alternative would be a quick and pitiless death. He noted the fear in their eyes and sighed with pleasure. This intimidation had been one of his intentions when he had set the explosives in the first place. His heart softened a little, though, when he noticed how downcast Lena and Miranda looked. "This is a good thing," he said. "If we lost to Stellar Technology, they'd have treated us just the same." He really believed this. He had seen Stellar Technology's cruelty firsthand, and compared to what he knew its people were capable of, this was nothing. That's right, said Olivia, slowly coming around to his way of thinking. If we lost, they'd capture us for their evil experiments. They wouldn't spare any of us, men, women, or children. At first, she thought that Charles had been trying to ease their guilt, but now she realized that her words were true. If they had been defeated, they would have suffered a fate worse than death at the hands of Stellar Technologies scientists. Miranda and Lena nodded reluctantly, showing Olivia that her words had helped to sway them at least a little. By this point, Alice and Zack had arrived, rushing into the safety of the energy shield. "This is horrible," said Alice. "How did it come to this? Why does there always have to be a war?" She knew there was no alternative, but simply knowing the truth didn't make it any easier to accept. Charles sighed. "I don't like war either," he said. "War means casualties. It means losing those closest to me. It means my family coming into danger. But as long as the human heart continues to beat, there will be war. We can't stop it. We can only do our best to help our loved ones get through to the other side of it." "That's it," said Kevin. "That's all we can hope to do, protect the ones we care about." At these words, he found himself turning almost by instinct to Lena, and he wasn't entirely surprised to find that she too had turned to him. The Stellar Technology soldiers caught in the sea of fire cursed, wailed, and begged for mercy. "You devils! How could you do this? Save us! You'll pay for this!" But no matter how loud their cries, or how deadly their threats were, it was useless. More than 18,000 soldiers had stormed the Dawn Alliance's base, but only 8,000 had been able to escape. Those who had made it out alive were severely injured, and some of the survivors died of their injuries soon after. In most cases, it wasn't the fire, but the smoke that killed them. The base had been built from wood at Charles's express order. It had taken a lot of labor to fell the trees for the walls, not to mention to refine the axes that had chopped the wood, which he had seen to personally. To carry out his plan, he had also plundered gasoline from the nearby gas stations, in addition to straw and other combustible materials from the local farmsteads. These materials had been stuffed into the walls of the military buildings so that when he was done, the buildings were in effect the perfect kindling, just waiting for the spark to set them alight. He had been sure to safeguard against accidental fires. When it had come time to build the trenches and bunkers, he had insisted on doing so himself. In the process, he had hidden many explosives and combustible materials from the military. He had plugged the fortifications with stones, gasoline barrels, and straw that he had been keeping in the energy storage space, before sealing everything with mud. He made sure that the explosives were pressed deep into the mixture of mud and stones, so that they would only be ignited if the entire wall or ground was broken. When he had realized that Stellar Technology had been preparing to launch its attack the night before, he had placed some blue flame energy gem fragments he had collected from the mine into the walls. He had also inserted some explosive flame amulets, which he had planned to use as detonators. Lena had already demonstrated the power of the explosive flame amulets. A single amulet could kill a level 4 or even a level 5 paranormal. In other words, he would have no problems using them to detonate the explosives in the walls. When they erupted, they didn't just engulf the area in fire, but also filled the air with smoke and dust. This made things even more dangerous, leaving many of those soldiers, who had somehow managed to escape the fire, choking on the fumes. Behind the energy shield, the Dawn Alliance didn't suffer any great losses, although some who hadn't managed to enter the shield in time were also caught in the fire. Many of these members were from the reinforcement group and hadn't followed Charles's orders to get inside, so no one in the Alliance blamed him for their deaths. The fire burned for 3 full hours before it finally began to subside. Once it had died down, the area was strewn with the bodies of Stellar Technologies soldiers. Most were dead, but some survivors could be heard groaning and cursing. "Evil," one of them moaned. "You're pure evil." Although there were some medics among the ranks, they were severely limited in the number of victims they could treat. Although they tried their best, less than half of the survivors made it out alive. Even those who could be saved were left in a miserable state with hideous injuries. They were in so much pain that it wasn't clear if saving their lives would be merciful or would simply prolong their torment. Fewer than 1,000 Stellar Technology soldiers had been outside the area at the time of the explosions. They were terrified to enter the base and see what had befallen their comrades. They held back, refusing to come any closer to the carnage. "This isn't war," said one. "This is hell." "These people are monsters," said another. "What cowards!" said another. "They couldn't even face us in a fair fight. They resorted to these dirty tricks instead." They looked up at the energy shield and the members of the Dawn Alliance standing behind it. One of the soldiers dropped to his knees and cried out, "We're done for! We'll never take this place!" One after another, the soldiers dropped their weapons and fell to the ground with their hands above their heads in surrender. "We could never win. Not against that demon. Please, spare us! We're begging you!" A gunshot tore through the air. The first soldier who had surrendered looked down at the bullet hole in his chest. Then he looked up at his fellow soldier who had shot him and gasped, "You? How could you?" It was one thing to be faced with the enemy's heartless massacre, and another to be turned on by their own comrades. "Somebody catch him," a woman cried out, pointing at the soldier who had fired the gun. "He can't get away with this." The crowd descended on the soldier, who dropped his gun and raised his hands. "It's all too much," he cried. "I joined this organization because I thought I was making a difference. I left my home, my family, my loved ones, and for this meaningless slaughter. It's all too much." The other Stellar Technology soldiers were saddened to hear their shattered comrades' laments. Some of them had joined the organization because they had been tempted by the benefits it had offered, while others had been threatened into doing so. But no matter the reason they had joined, they had all eventually given up every one of their principles and values in their eagerness to serve Stellar Technology. Without thinking about it, they had done whatever they had needed to do to keep climbing the career ladder. They had even sold out some of their own friends and colleagues, giving them up as guinea pigs for the corporation's experiments. No matter what they did, though, they were never going to reach the higher levels of the organization. Each was destined only to be a slightly more fearsome dog in a pack of other dogs. The truth of the matter was that it wasn't their lack of merit or loyalty that kept them from reaching those upper levels. It was their background. It was simply impossible to rise to the top if they had started from a poorer family. The higher-ups could tell who had started from the bottom, and they refused to allow them to climb to the top. It was natural, then, that they had come to feel that their actions weren't their own, that their crimes had been committed by someone else. A cloud of dust in the distance settled. As it cleared, it revealed a group of people in ragged clothes rushing toward them. Their movements were stiff, but fast. As they drew closer, the soldiers could see that the corners of their mouths were stained in blood. Their eyes were either pure white or red, their skin mottled and crisscrossed with ink-black veins. "Zombies!" cried one of the soldiers. The minds of the soldiers went blank. They had been so fixated in their battle against the Dawn Alliance that they hadn't counted on coming across zombies too, let alone zombies running directly at them. Once they had fully absorbed this new threat, they began to spring into action. "Run!" called out a soldier. "We're no match for them!" shouted another. "There's too many of them. There must be over 10,000. How come we didn't hear about their approach? Where are the scouts? Why didn't they inform us?" If the soldiers had been at their peak, well rested, and properly equipped, they might have stood a chance against this new threat. But with so many of them so seriously injured, and their morale at its weakest, their odds were much lower. Besides, this number of zombies could only have been corralled by a powerful leader of some sort, and there was no telling what other powers such a leader might have. "Quick, cover us!" ordered one of the soldiers, approaching one of the vehicles. "Give us a chance to get around them before they circle us completely." Marked out by their uniforms, the higher-ranking soldiers piled into the vehicles, not sparing a thought for those lower down the pecking order. These poorer soldiers looked on in despair, unable to believe that only hours before they had been ready to put their lives on the line for their superiors. The vehicles' engines came on. The higher-ranking officers were clearly determined to flee back to their base. Even if it was surrounded by enemy soldiers, it was their best hope. When one officer, a blonde woman, opened the door to one of the trucks, a dog jumped out from the back seat. She picked it up and took it back inside, closing the door behind her. One of the soldiers let out a miserable laugh. "You see," he said, "they treat their dogs better than they treat us." The other soldiers could see that this was true. Their superiors had been more than happy to abandon their subordinates, and yet they had made sure to save the life of this pet dog. The vehicle sped off. "I can't take it anymore," said one of the soldiers. "We're going to die out here." Another soldier, covered in burn marks, yelled in fury. He raised his machine gun and fired in the direction of the vehicles. The weapon spat out a stream of bullets, their shells rattling to the ground. One of the vehicles caught fire, exploded, and collapsed onto one side. The soldiers cheered, taking up their weapons and firing on the other vehicles, successfully bursting their tires and sending them skidding off and crashing in all directions. Let's teach them a lesson. Yeah, how dare they leave us behind? Kill them! Some officers clambered out of one of the upturned cars. Although they had fury in their eyes, the zombies were approaching, and they didn't have time to turn back and take revenge on the soldiers. Instead, they called out to one of the other vehicles. Hey, stop! Bring us along! We'll die out here! The other vehicles didn't stop. They didn't even slow down. They careened away, the people inside not only abandoning their inferiors, but their fellow officers too. Clearly, they only cared about saving their own hides. If the zombies managed to encircle them, their armored vehicles would have been of no use. Even a level 5 paranormal couldn't easily fight their way out of such an enormous horde. When faced with a crowd of regular humans, a lone level 5 paranormal could easily be able to fight their way out because they would be able to use the crowd's fear against them. But a horde of zombies didn't know fear. They were like machines, attacking all forms of life with no thought for their own safety. They're going to escape! Shouted one of the soldiers. And it was true. The cars at the head of the fleet had broken free of the zombies before they had had a chance to form a blockade against them. The officers on one of these cars couldn't believe their luck. We did it! One of them cried out, laughing hysterically. Think you can catch up to us, you dumb zombies? Shouted another. They cursed, shouted, and shook their fists at the zombies, partly out of relief, and partly to vent their guilt for abandoning their fellow soldiers. But then they felt the vehicle shake. What's that? One of them asked. I don't know, shouted the driver. It's an unknown force threw the vehicle to the side, and the car launched into the air before smashing into the ground. When the officers finally crawled out, they were shocked to be confronted by a crowd of terrifying monsters with long tentacles. The tentacles, which they realized must have tipped their vehicle, waved at them almost in a greeting. There was nothing the officers could do other than scream as the zombies descended on them. The members of the Dawn Alliance watched in shock from their vantage point behind the energy shield. No sooner had the Stellar Technology Army been decimated by Charles's fire than the survivors had been faced with a horde of vicious zombies. Olivia noticed that her hands were clenched. She took a deep breath, and then she asked Charles, "What should we do next?" She had always thought of herself as a smart person, but in the face of all this chaos, it had occurred to her that the truest quality of a leader wasn't wisdom, but calmness under pressure. Doesn't matter how smart you are if you can't keep your head together, she thought. If you can't keep calm in battle, what's the use in having those brains in the first place? She thought it much better to be one of those who could face apparently unbeatable odds, yet still raise their hands and let out a battle cry, inspiring all those around them. Alice, Zach, said Charles, go to the earth door and the water door to pull up the energy shield. The rest of you stay here and await further orders. Take some time to rest. Alice and Zach accepted the order and left. It was only when Charles had given the Alliance members permission to rest that they realized how tired they truly were. The 3 hours of the fire had drained them completely. It had been exhausting to hear the cries of those caught in the flames. The Stellar Technology soldiers may have been the enemy, but it had been traumatic all the same to watch so many of them die in such a horrible way. Charles wasn't overly concerned about the effects of the last few hours on his followers. He knew that the more of these scenes they experienced, the greater their resilience would become, until one day, many of them might well become fearless commanders themselves. Bearing witness to horror after horror was simply the only way to reach that goal. When the Stellar Technology soldiers saw their officers' vehicles destroyed, they cheered. That'll show them to abandon us, shouted one. Yeah, shouted another. That's what you get! With these cries, they were able to burn off some of the resentment they felt toward their leaders for having left them behind. They couldn't shake off the scene where the female officer had saved her pet dog. It seemed to underscore like nothing else just how little their superiors must have thought of the soldiers themselves. Although there was no real point in taking pleasure in their officers' misfortune, especially with the zombie horde on the approach, they couldn't help their baser urges, so they threw everything into roaring with glee and punching the air. Their joy was short-lived, though. After consuming the officers who had escaped in the vehicles, the zombies rushed toward the surviving soldiers. They formed a wide line and quickly sealed off any chance of escape. From the top of the wall, Charles spotted an opportunity to teach his followers a lesson in military tactics. "Notice how the zombies are sealing off every direction," he said. "With that kind of strategizing, there must be some kind of leader among them." "I've heard that level 5 zombies have an almost human intelligence," said Miranda. Charles nodded. After all, he had been the one who had told her this. "They'd need more than just one level 5 zombie to control this many of them," he said. "Even 5 of them wouldn't manage it." From what he knew of the zombies from his past life, a level 5 zombie could control between 1 and 5,000 lower-level zombies. If this horde of zombies was controlled by a sufficient number of level 5 zombies, they would pose a terrifying threat indeed. But what scared him even more was that something yet more powerful must have been keeping these lower-level zombies from attacking one another. Left to their own devices, lower-level zombies would attack and eat their own kind. And yet here came an entire horde working in unison. There must either be some zombie of a level Charles hadn't yet encountered in control of the horde, or a human is behind it, he thought. Whichever was the case, he realized it was bad news. While some of the Stellar Technology soldiers fired on the zombies, others fled to the energy shield and pleaded for protection. "Please, save us!" one shouted. "I'm begging you!" "We're all humans, aren't we? It's the zombies who are the enemy. Let us in!" "Whatever you want us to do, we'll do it!" Although the soldiers' pleading left Charles unmoved, some of the members of the Dawn Alliance couldn't bear it. A paranormal named Jessica said to Charles, "Sir, this isn't the time to be vindictive. We're facing the enemy of all mankind. Let's let these people in and increase our numbers." "Let them in?" cried out an opposing Alliance member. "They were dead set on killing us just now." "Why would we forgive the people waging war on us?" asked another. "Keep your enemy of mankind nonsense to yourself." Although it was clear that the Stellar Technology soldiers were well and truly beaten, these Alliance members couldn't simply forget the fighting of the previous nights, when these people now begging for forgiveness had tried to hunt them all down. No matter how miserable they looked or how loud they pleaded, they weren't about to forgive them now. "Things have changed," said Jessica. "Before we were on opposing sides, but now we're up against a common enemy." "She's right," said one of the Stellar Technology soldiers at the energy shield. "We have a common enemy!" "Save us and let us help you beat them!" cried another. Charles pointed in the direction of Stellar Technology's base. "Over there," he said. "A few nights ago, there were more than 10,000 people living and working, minding their own business. Less than half of them survived after you'd had your way with them. If you want to help us, it's very simple. Go back and revive those people and then apologize to their faces." "That's right," said another Alliance member, turning to Jessica. "If we forgive these monsters, what does that say about our respect for the dead?" "It's not up to us to forgive them," said another. "It's up to all those people they killed." Jessica looked at everyone in disbelief. "Just listen to yourselves," she said. "How can you be so heartless? It was hardly like they gave the order to kill those people. Do they have to die just because they were scared of disobeying some higher-up that would have executed them in a heartbeat for not following orders?" Charles rubbed his forehead and turned to Olivia. "Who is this lady?" he asked. "Whose student is she?" Olivia shook her head. "I don't know. She must be new." She knew all the original members of the Dawn Alliance, but she had never seen Jessica before. "That lady is right," said one of the Stellar Technology soldiers from behind the shield. "We were in the wrong, but it wasn't our fault." "The things we did," pleaded another. "Someone forced us to do them. Why would we commit such atrocities unless we had no other choice? Let us make it up to you by helping you fight these monsters." The zombies were getting closer by the second. The soldiers watched their approach, and their faces drained of color. Charles turned to Jessica. "If you want to save these people so badly," he said, "then sure, I'll give you a chance." "What do you mean?" she said. "What chance?" The Alliance members around Charles looked anxious. They wondered what he was up to. Had this woman really changed his mind? They had known him to be cruel for so long that they could hardly believe he might actually be taking pity on these people. Charles drew a knife from his belt and handed it to Jessica. He nodded in the direction of the zombies. Although many of them had been gunned down, the remainder still shuffled toward the soldiers. "All zombies at level 3 and above have bodies of steel," he said. "You can't pierce them with ordinary bullets. Even if you're using a machine gun, you won't break through to their vital organs. But with a knife like this, you can cut through any part of them. Take this and help those people out of their mess." Jessica stared at the knife. "You can't be serious," she said. "How can I possibly be a match for all those zombies?" She had only asked Charles to give the soldiers a chance. She hadn't meant to volunteer to save them all by herself. This was the difference between her and Sylvia. Sylvia was willing to sacrifice her life for the greater good. Jessica's generosity wasn't quite so extreme. "If I remember correctly," said Charles, "I gave an order. I wasn't asking a question." She was scared by the look in his eye. "What do you mean?" she asked. He stepped toward her. "I mean that it's impossible to save those animals out there," he said, "but you'll find that out soon enough." And with that, he created an opening in the energy shield and pushed her through. She cried out as she fell to the ground and found herself outside the shield. Charles believed that Jessica's high-minded manner of kindness would get them all killed. He couldn't allow somebody like that to stay in his team. The Alliance members were delighted to see her so blatantly called out on her apparent selflessness. As far as they were concerned, it was all well and good if she wanted to sacrifice herself to help those in need, but they didn't want to be dragged into it with her. When she hit the ground, Charles's knife was thrown from her grip, sailing through the air before landing hilt deep in the ground some distance away. The soldiers had watched its progress through the air, and they tentatively approached it, eyeing up their comrades' moves. "That's a good knife," one of them said. "And it's got my name on it," said another. The soldier at the head of the group pounced on the weapon and pulled it out of the dirt. He swept it over his head and then across the ground, where, hissing, it sliced through the dirt and stone at their feet as though butter. The soldiers around him were wide-eyed, their mouths open, captivated by the power of the blade. It would be impossible for them to help everybody out of the circle of approaching zombies, but with a weapon like this, they just might be able to fight their way out alone. The soldier with the knife laughed and said, "With this blade," but he was cut short as a sword pierced through his chest from behind. He groaned and keeled over. The soldier who had crept up behind him snatched the knife and sprinted in the direction of the zombies. "He's trying to get out alone!" shouted one of the soldiers before the others joined in. "Stop him! Don't let him make it!" They were furious. Some paranormals cast long-range spells at him, taking him down almost instantly. He didn't even have time to scream. Once again, the knife was thrown through the air to land clattering on the ground, and the soldiers lunged for the weapon, this time squabbling and cursing in their hunger to possess it. Up on the wall, Charles sighed. "If one person had taken the lead and made sure that they had used the knife together," he said, "some of them would have escaped by now. But look at them. No trust in one another, and no sense to speak of. Nothing but a pack of dogs." He looked into the distance. Only a small portion of the Stellar Technology Army had come to the energy shield to beg for mercy. Most of the rest of the army was fighting the zombies. The regular soldiers who were already seriously injured had been eaten by the zombies early in their advance, while others in a better state had picked up any weapon they could find and tried to defend themselves. But although their machine guns could easily have mowed down any ordinary enemy, they could not stall the iron zombies that led the charge, who appeared not even to notice the bullets glancing off them. Of course, the front line of iron zombies wasn't completely unbroken, so the more vulnerable zombies behind them were shot down. But these felled zombies gave the others an immediate source of sustenance. Some of them actually passed around pieces of their fallen comrades. The soldiers despaired when they realized what was happening. It was a very primitive type of cooperation, but they were stunned to see the zombies capable of it. Before long, the machine guns overheated and turned useless. While some paranormals were able to attack from a distance, the zombies' speed largely counteracted any defense they were giving. Finally, the paranormals found they had spent all their soul energy, and their defense was over. The zombies reached the front line of soldiers. The soldiers screamed, running in any direction they could, without caring about anything else. But it was too late. The zombies were upon them. In only one day, the members of the Dawn Alliance had witnessed two large-scale tragedies. Some of them were so affected that they had to look away from the carnage of battle. Although they all despised their enemies and knew they could never forgive them for their actions, it was nevertheless terrifying to see the effects of the zombies' attack. It was enough to make several members of the Alliance feel nauseous. All of them shared the same thought. What if that were us? If we were the ones out there facing those monsters, would we be able to win? After battling for an hour, The remaining Stellar Technology soldiers were quickly wiped out by the zombie horde. None of them managed to escape. Even if they had somehow had access to the Alliance's weapons, which had been forged specially by Charles, nothing would have saved them from their terrible fate. Some of the soldiers elected to end themselves before the zombies had the chance to make them an unwilling member of their ranks. Olivia looked around the crowd and saw that many of her people had been physically sick at the sight. She sighed and understood that it was time for them to leave. She said to Charles, "I think it's safe to say that everyone's lost their fighting spirit. Let's take everyone back. We can fight these zombies tomorrow." When the Alliance members heard her words, many of them looked equal parts ashamed and grateful. Charles nodded, and then he ordered, "Follow the inside of the energy shield and build a 40-foot wall around the city. Then everyone can go and rest." He had already collected enough materials for them to complete the job. Dale took charge of the Earth-type paranormals, and they followed Charles's instructions. He put some of the bio-altered paranormals in charge of moving and cutting stones. Lena's face paled slightly, and she clenched her fists. "As if facing terrifying monsters isn't awful enough," she exclaimed bitterly. "I can't believe there are still so many people who want to fight other humans. If Stellar Technology hadn't attacked, we'd have easily been able to deal with these zombies." Those who overheard her agreed with her wholeheartedly, and hated Stellar Technology even more. "That's right," someone said. "If it weren't for those beasts, we wouldn't have to deal with these zombie scum. What's wrong with them? Damn Stellar Technology." Once they had vented their frustrations, some of the Alliance members burst into tears. After they had experienced two hellish scenes consecutively, not everyone's mental faculties could bear it. Most of them had been at the brink of their emotional capacity, but Lena's words had touched a nerve for many. At that moment, every person present hated everyone involved with Stellar Technology. They knew that if it hadn't been for them, the Alliance's defenses would have been more than capable of dealing with the zombies. The injustice felt visceral. The Alliance members simply wanted to survive, and none of them could understand why they always had to suffer. Most of them thought that it was enough that they were constantly expected to face monsters, and they wondered why they had to battle other humans too. Charles fixed his sister with a sympathetic expression. He knew that she had every right to her emotions, and there was a lot of truth to what she had said. Miranda sighed. "If humans were capable of working together, the zombies wouldn't be a problem at all," she said. "It's truly baffling that something with no intelligence can possibly threaten a species as advanced as us. But it's precisely our so-called intelligence that leads us to fight among ourselves." "Are those defensive preparations you made still in place?" Kevin asked Charles. Everyone's eyes lit up. If Charles had prepared defenses in other directions, it might be possible to use them against the zombies. "Yes," Charles replied. But before anyone could get too excited, he added, "However, the detonation process needs to be prepared in advance. We would also need the zombies to enter a specific area, which it's unlikely they'll do on their own." "I'll be the bait," Kevin said, without hesitation. Charles shook his head. "We'll talk about it tomorrow. I'll finish setting it up today." He ordered everyone to return to their own residences to rest. The battle hadn't cost them too many casualties, but it had obviously had a significant mental impact on them all. He knew that it was a simple fact of life after the apocalypse. People had been given no warning or chance to adapt. It was a matter of sink or swim, and those who couldn't adapt quickly and think on their feet wouldn't survive for long. He shook his head sadly. He knew that many Alliance members had likely been deeply affected by the events of the day. He suspected several might even be on the brink of nervous breakdowns. But it was an unavoidable situation. He didn't have time to counsel those who couldn't cope. He knew that Miranda would almost definitely want to offer them some sort of help, but she would have to stand down. They couldn't waste her talents on a minority of soldiers, and even she was becoming more discerning and understood that there were limits to what they could provide. Once the new city wall had been built, a small number of people were allocated the task of defending and patrolling it. The rest of them were directed back to their dwellings to rest. But it was a restless night for most. The quiet solitude gave them all ample opportunity to revisit the day's events in their minds. Charles had told them to sleep, so that they all had some buffer time. But as they all settled down for the night, the zombies continued to attack the wall that separated them from the Alliance. The monsters would frequently attack the energy shields, but although the sound was frequent, it wasn't loud, and most people found it relatively easy to sleep through. Zombies were stronger than humans, but they were easier adversaries to deal with. When everyone had returned to their homes, Many people began to break down as a result of the pressure and trauma. They squatted in the corners of their rooms, or sat in the fetal position and rocked themselves gently. From time to time, there was an occasional cry of, "I can't take it anymore!" And someone would rush from their home or apartment and attack anyone who happened to be nearby. Charles had a zero-tolerance policy for attacks on other members, and he distributed punishment mercilessly. Miranda, Anthony, and the others patrolled the residential area and had the unfortunate task of reprimanding the wretched souls who had cracked under the strain. Miranda killed a man who had attempted to attack a female neighbor. 68, she thought, as she wiped her blade clean. She hadn't meant to keep count of how many people she had been forced to kill, but her mind kept track all the same. She didn't know the exact number of monsters she had faced in the past, but in all that time, her hands had never trembled. But each time she cut down a former Alliance member, her heart broke a little more, and there was an undeniable shake to her strike. She knew that she was only taking out those who had chosen to inflict violence on others, but even though she knew their actions were inexcusable, they were still living people who had suffered a great deal. The neighbor of the man that Miranda had killed looked shaken. "Did you really have to kill him?" the woman asked. "He wasn't in his right mind. Surely there could have been some way we could have helped him." Miranda shook her head sadly. "Someone had to stop him from hurting others," she said. "I'd rather his death was on my conscience than anyone else's. I know we're all under pressure, but we can't use that as an excuse to do terrible things to each other." While the Dawn Alliance and Stellar Technology had been fighting throughout the day, the news that Charles had asked Greg to spread had made it as far as Montreal. The military was always interested in the Alliance's movements, and they knew better than to leave Charles and the others unchecked for long. Subsequently, the evil deeds of Stellar Technology had once again become public knowledge. The only difference was that this time, besides denouncing the military, they had also made their greed obvious to the world. Rumors began to fly around the military camp. "Have you heard? Stellar Technology has already developed a serum that can increase a person's strength. I heard if it's misused, it'll turn a person into a zombie. Is this how they've been increasing their strength? That's right, it's terrible. If it really works, though, wouldn't you take the risk?" "Hell no! I heard it barely works. If I want to improve, I might as well use cultivation methods." Although some saw the obvious downsides to using the serum in such a precarious world, a shortcut that could rapidly increase one's strength was extremely attractive, particularly when incidents of paranormals bullying ordinary people were epidemic in most places. Many paranormals felt that they could do whatever they wanted, because others were powerless to stop them. Tensions between them and ordinary people were high, and there was a lot of animosity on both sides. The paranormals were abusive, and the ordinary people were envious. What was worse for the ordinary people was that they had no choice but to accept the protection of paranormals, which made them feel even more humiliated. Often they had to offer them food that they had painstakingly collected, or weapons they had earned in exchange for effective protection. There were others, though, who refused to give more power to the paranormals, and had decided not to accept their help under any circumstances. They had placed their faith in their own abilities, and hadn't been deterred by the risks of cultivating their own martial arts abilities. They had bravely persevered with their goal, and had learned to use their fists to protect their families. These people were openly hostile toward the paranormals, who liked to bully others, and when word of Stellar Technology's serum spread, they were immediately intrigued. Some of them wanted to obtain the miracle elixir and use it to increase their strength. However, others thought it was a bad idea and didn't want the method to become commonplace. In an additional blow to Stellar Technology, the location of their bases had been leaked. Subsequently, many people had started to gather around the gates and declare open warfare on the people inside. The protest began with a small group, but as time passed, their number increased to more than 100,000 people. They stood vigilantly outside the building, and every time their number increased, so did their courage and confidence. It wasn't long before they felt as though they had enough support to attempt an attack. The army had set up camp near Stellar Technology's second base, but they didn't disband the group of protesters immediately. Instead, they followed the instructions of their superiors and simply prevented anyone from entering or leaving the premises. When the number of protesters reached 100,000, though, they knew it was time to intervene. "What are you all doing?" one of the higher-ranking soldiers asked a man at the front of the crowd. "We're here to deal with Stellar Technology," he replied boldly. "Their actions have violated human rights, and we're going to eliminate them." "My family was captured by Stellar Technology," someone added. "They were used like cattle and died in the mines. I'll avenge them, even if it costs me my life." The soldier didn't have a rebuttal for these claims. If what those people said was true, then nothing would dissuade them from taking revenge for their slain family members. Soon the air was filled with the cries of people who had similar stories. Whether these could be verified was indeterminable. "My parents were captured by Stellar Technology and treated as experimental subjects. My child! They stole my child!" Although the military couldn't be sure whether every claim was true, they knew that at least some of them were. It made the soldiers uncomfortable with their mission to protect the building. They knew that some of the crowd was undoubtedly made up of troublemakers who were looking for any excuse to fight, particularly since Stellar Technology usually captured entire families and allowed few of them to slip through the net. But the atrocities the company had committed were real. The soldiers were particularly affected by the people who had family members who had died in the mines. The incident had been shocking, and it was still fresh in all their memories. It wasn't only the soldiers who were moved. People in the crowd who saw the suffering and angst of those around them didn't doubt that Stellar Technology was an abomination, regardless of whether every individual claim was true. After all, the company had committed so many atrocities that it was impossible for the soldiers to discern fact from fiction. The high-ranking soldier was about to advise the crowd to disperse and stand down when he received an order from his superiors. "Retreat, let them in." The soldier hesitated. He couldn't believe that he had heard correctly, but he had sworn an oath to follow orders, and so he hesitantly stepped aside. The people who were gathered by the gate were shocked, but it didn't take them long to push past him. They excitedly entered the base's grounds and swarmed the entranceway. An officer angrily questioned the supervising officer. "Why'd you let them in?" he demanded. "It's going to be a bloodbath in there." He wasn't the only one who was concerned. Many soldiers thought following the order was absurd. "I know we've sworn to obey every order," one of the soldiers said, "but I really think we deserve an explanation for this one." "This is the commander's order," the superior snapped at the man who had questioned him. "Take a look at how many of those thugs there are. They outnumber us 10 to 1. Do you want to be beaten to death by a crowd while you protect monsters? If we protect the evildoers, we're no better than they are." "We're soldiers," the man replied hotly. "It doesn't matter if we're outnumbered. We need to do our duty." "There's no glory in defending evil," the superior shouted. "There were over 30 million people living in Butte once. How many of those have been turned into zombies or mutants because of this company and their disgusting experiments?" The soldier remained silent. "I understand that you aren't afraid of sacrifice," the leading officer said, "but there are some fights we need to face, and there are others we don't. We need to focus our efforts on fighting the monsters we're charged with fighting. We aren't here to protect a company that adds to the horde. If you die here protecting bad people, that's one less soldier to fight the actual enemy. Now stand down." The soldiers in charge of the defense couldn't think of anything to say to their commanding officer. They knew there was going to be an upheaval in Stellar Technology's base, and they felt uncomfortable about turning a blind eye to violence. They had always believed that their presence was enough to deter others from choosing violence, but they knew now that this was no longer the case. All of the soldiers in the military had been educated to a high level, and when they had joined the forces, they had received further training in combat and tactical approaches. So they were all aware of the potential risks of allowing the crowd to follow through with their violent intentions. But despite their concerns, there was little they could do but accept the order and stand down. They knew the superior officer had highlighted an important fact. Only they could deal with monsters. It would be foolish for them to waste resources protecting a company that was actively creating more adversaries for them. The people in the building were effectively responsible for war crimes. "Charge!" yelled someone in the crowd. The excited mob rushed into Stellar Technology's base. They were neither organized nor prepared and saw no reason to be so. Since most of Stellar Technology's soldiers had been deployed elsewhere, the crowd quickly overcame the remaining guards. The gates outside Stellar Technology were quickly breached and taken off their hinges. The useless pieces of metal lay on the ground and were trampled beneath the feet of the furious mob. Not everyone who had sieged the company was a desperate criminal. Many of them had legitimate reasons for wanting the company's workers dead. Their self-justified fury led them to crush every obstacle in their way. The disorganized chaos made the fight an unpredictable one. There was no easy way to differentiate between friend and foe as the mob searched for the Stellar Technology employees, with no intention of showing them any mercy. It had been over a month since the apocalypse had descended upon the world, and everyone who had survived until that point had adapted to the era to some degree. Thus, none of the crowd had any qualms about killing people on sight, whether they were a guard or a worker. "There's a basement here!" someone shouted. A man had tripped over a handle on the floor and had found a secret entrance to an underground room. He called some others over to help him lift the door. His exclamation soon attracted many assistants, and they lifted the basement hatch. In the room below, the researchers who had been working there didn't have time to organize a defense. One member of the crowd told the others to leave one of the researchers alive for interrogation, but others wanted to set fire to the lab in order to destroy whatever research was being conducted there. When the crowd entered the basement, some people looked around for research materials and drugs, and others tried to capture several of the researchers alive. It quickly became evident that it was harder to protect than to destroy, and many of the paranormals who had personal vendettas against the workers were able to take out as many of them as they wanted. Then, they set fire to all the research. There were mixed reactions to the fire. Not everyone wanted the new serum to be made public, and many of them had hoped that the formula would never see the light of day. These people were mainly paranormals who had been powerful to begin with, and they didn't want others to have access to power. The paranormals who used their powers to torment those without knew that if ordinary people had the opportunity to gain power, they would immediately retaliate against those who had preyed on them. The paranormals had enjoyed abusing their power and weren't in a hurry to share it or face the consequences of their actions. But there was an equal number of people who didn't want to see the research destroyed. "Kill them! They're trying to destroy the research!" someone shouted. When they saw that the paranormals were destroying the research, those who wanted to obtain the formula for themselves began to attack. It wasn't long before everyone knew that a battle to control the information was imminent. Soon the entire basement was in flames and facing a domestic battle. In a regular fight, the paranormals would undoubtedly have had the advantage. Even those who were biologically altered had a much higher attack power than a martial artist of the same level. But in such a small space, it wasn't always about whose attack was stronger. Instead, the fight relied more on whose attack could hit the enemy first. Even a level 4 paranormal could be killed by a level 2 martial artist if the hit was deadly enough. When the paranormals realized that their comrades had been taken out so easily, they redoubled their efforts and tried in vain to move the fight to a more open location. Hellfire that burned everything in its path, ice blades that froze life, and wind blades that cut through steel had turned the entire basement into a death trap. The earth-powered paranormals had managed to collapse parts of the ceiling and ground that connected the first floor to the basement, merging them together to create barricades. Some of the smarter fighters had managed to escape the basement as soon as the battle had started. They had then attacked the entrance in an attempt to bury the whole place. While the basement filled with smoke, other people were busy destroying other rooms. Laboratories were torn down, and every inch of the ground was covered in glass and debris. Everyone was mindful of where they stepped in case a powerful earth-powered paranormal managed to split open the floor and send them tumbling down several stories to their deaths. In under half an hour, Stellar Technology's entire base was reduced to ruins and scorched earth. The original basement rooms had been transformed into deep pits, and the buildings had become nothing more than crumbling relics. Countless lives had been lost. The soldiers who had been guarding the area for 4 weeks looked at the scene in dismay, and their hearts filled with pain. "Is this what we are trying to protect?" one of the officers muttered to himself. "I'm glad we didn't get involved. It doesn't matter which side won. It was always going to be a tragedy in the end." The violence that the mob had demonstrated had somewhat shaken his belief in protecting them. An officer beside him patted his shoulder and comforted him. "We aren't here to protect people who want to resort to violence," he said gently. "I don't know about you, but I'm only willing to sacrifice my life for those who deserve to be protected." None of them had any more doubts about the soldier who had enforced the order to stand down. It was true that they weren't afraid of sacrifice, but they weren't about to forego their lives for lunatics. Stellar Technology had 3 bases in total, which were spread throughout the state. The move was a testament to the owners' cunning minds and infinite resources. They had paid a fortune to secure their knowledge, and each base acted as a small stronghold. One of the bases had been built near the location Kevin had chosen for the Dawn Alliance's base. Once Charles had sacked it, it had been almost completely abandoned. Now, the second base had been destroyed by the group of protesters and thieves. The crowd had defeated the occupants with ease, and there were so many protesters that nothing could stand in their way. Once the protesters knew that two of the bases had been eradicated, they decided they weren't going to let the third base remain standing. The last base was located in a small town that used special methods to control all the people in the nearby houses. Usually, when the workers went in and out of the base, they pretended to be locals. Once news spread about the attack on the second base, those who worked at the third one abandoned all pretense and completely sealed off the town. No one was allowed in or out. It was apparent to everyone that any law enforcement officer had effectively removed themselves from the situation, so the workers killed anyone who came close and had no fear of repercussions. They knew it was every person for themselves. Inside the final base, chaos reigned. The remaining employees were in utter confusion and panic. How was the base discovered? We need to fight back. This is our last base. We have to defend it. Call headquarters for backup. Headquarters is too far away. There is no backup. Because they knew they would be targeted at any moment, they prepared themselves for an attack. Soldiers hid behind the building and wait. Others aimed machine guns out of the windows, prepared to shoot anyone who approached. When the attackers began to arrive, most of them were paranormals. Therefore, any mundane efforts to fortify the base were easily destroyed. The final base also happened to be the main location for the majority of the company's troops. If the protesters managed to breach the fortress, it would effectively be game over for the company. As soon as their evil deeds had become common knowledge, it had opened the floodgates for every righteous person who had a grudge against the company. The collapse of social order and the law had also cost the company dearly, as it had become apparent that even the military had turned their back on them. There would be no trial for any of them, nor any likelihood of mercy. Although Stellar Technologies' soldiers were strong, they weren't well trained or particularly honorable. The best of them had been sent on other missions, so the ones that were left were the weakest of the troop. Many of the base's employees had begun to regret the fact that all the bases had been built underground. It had originally seemed like a good idea, since it concealed them from prying eyes and aided them in their secrecy. Now that their locations had been revealed, however, it seemed like a death sentence. Whether a water-type paranormal poured water into the base and drowned everyone inside, or a fire-type paranormal set it on fire, the inhabitants of the house were like fish in a barrel. The angry mob approached the base, intent on destruction. Since they were marching directly from their previous successful campaign, they were even more incensed. When the first people reached the final base, however, they were met with something unexpected. The entrance hall of the base was filled with vast quantities of food. "There's a huge bag of rice here," one of the protesters told his companion. He picked up the sack of rice. "Quick," he told his friend. "Take anything good before the others get here." The price of food was too high for most people to waste such an opportunity. The only thing more valuable than food was crystal cores. The man's companion's eyes lit up, and she collected as much as she could. Many of the supermarkets had been completely ravaged by rats and cockroaches. The bag of rice alone would be enough to sustain them for a significant amount of time. "Do you have any idea how much this is worth?" the man said. "We need to get out of here before the others come and fight us for it." The first people on the scene quickly gathered their spoils and left. Stellar Technologies' 3 bases each had different functions. The second base, which the rioters had destroyed, had mainly been used to research drugs. The third base was a war base, but since many of their troops had already been deployed, most of the rooms were empty. Since the base had been left unguarded, the company's large amounts of resources were left sitting out in the open. The first protesters who reached the base saw the food and quickly took as much as they could carry. The smart ones left the scene immediately. However, there were also those who couldn't help but search for more. These people were the ones who ended up becoming part of the next chaotic battle. The reason the food was so obvious was that the inhabitants of the base had wanted to use it as both a distraction and a means of creating conflict among their enemies. While the protesters fought over the resources, the members of the company who had taken shelter in the basement began to try and figure out a plan for their escape. "We can't defend the base anymore," one of the scientific researchers said. "Even if they don't manage to find us, they've destroyed everything up there. The military is setting up camp nearby. Even if these rebels don't kill us, We still have to face the soldiers. The researchers knew that the military weren't the type of people who would harm them, but they also knew that they wouldn't hesitate to arrest them for crimes against humanity. Whether they faced the crowd or the military, none of them were escaping. The military also regularly employed ordinary people, and that was a problem for the researchers. Stellar Technology had frequently targeted ordinary people because it was easier to bully them than paranormals. They had taken advantage of many people over the previous months, and it was likely that those who had joined the military may have had friends who had been abducted by the company. If the soldiers did decide to attack them, they wouldn't have many means of defense. Although the soldiers were ordinary people, they were far more experienced in combat than any of the Stellar Technology employees. The company members were also aware that the military wasn't what it had once been. Although the soldiers had originally been more of a presence than an actual threat, and had been reluctant to harm people, many had undergone their own personal battles, and had realized that things weren't the same as before the apocalypse. If the researchers angered the soldiers, they would likely be met by a military force that had few qualms about sacrificing them to avoid thinking up a way to detain them as prisoners. "You all know what we need to do," one of the head researchers said. "We need to release the Death Water." "No!" several of the others cried at once. "That stuff is too unpredictable," one of the researchers said. "We only extracted a portion of it, and it managed to increase our progress by so much. If we lose it, our research will have been for nothing." "Are you seeing what's happening around you?" the head researcher demanded. "Look where we are. Our base is gone. If we don't release the monster, we will all die. It's our last chance." The scientific researchers looked nervously at the old man, who had once been the head of their department. "You can't be willing to unleash the most important creature we have," one of them said. Although their prospects were bleak, many of them were determined to hold on to the last shred of their life's work. They also knew that if they let that terrible creature free, there was only a slim chance that they themselves would be able to escape. One of the researchers swiftly hit the man who had objected across the face. He gaped at her in shock. "What was that for?" he demanded. "For being a complete moron," she replied. "We're all screwed either way. I think we should take out as many of those bastards as we can. Let the creature out. Let's hope it's strong enough to take out enough of them to give us the opportunity to escape." The others finally came around to the notion that their cause was lost. Death or imprisonment were their only other options, and so one of them opened a box and took out a bottle of liquid. "Are we sure about this?" the man holding the box asked nervously. "This is everything we've worked for." He used his earth powers to open a crack in the floor, revealing a gaping hole that reached many miles into the ground. "This is the monster that made all our research possible," he said. "The cyborg beasts, the genetic enhancement serum, the woman ran a hand through her blonde hair." "I know," she said. "But if we're going to die, it doesn't matter how valuable this thing is." The man poured the contents of the bottle into the ground. "Get to the secret passage," he shouted. "We need to get out of here as quickly as possible. Hopefully we'll be able to hide there for a while. Once the coast is clear, we can wait until the military flees and then escape." All of the remaining researchers retreated into the passageway and headed deep underground. As soon as they had gone, the ground began to tremble. The people on the upper floors continued to fight among themselves. Those who had managed to collect the best items had left the others to squabble for the leftovers. There were some among the group who didn't even need what they were taking. They had simply had enough of living through such a dreadful era and took pleasure in the thrill of destroying property and stealing things. All the dissatisfaction that people had felt during the bleakest months of their lives erupted in a spectacular display of frustration and violence. They burned rooms and evidence, they split open the floor, and they stole anything that was remotely valuable. Some people didn't care whether things were potentially valuable or not, and they burned everything in their sight. Just like the incident at the second base, the conflicts within the mob resurfaced and resulted in a massacre. They had managed to kill or injure a few hundred people from Stellar Technology, but the injuries and deaths they had inflicted on themselves had already exceeded 2,000. But even though most people in the bloodthirsty crowd were engrossed in their battle, they were all jolted back to reality when they felt the earth shake beneath their feet. "What's that?" someone shouted. "It's an earthquake," another replied. Everyone instinctively panicked when they felt the tremors, but they were soon distracted by something else. The ground had split apart, and the basement of the building was visible. Down there were hundreds of pieces of paper and many bottles filled with liquid. Although the crowd couldn't be certain these items were related to the coveted serum, many of them hoped that they were. They began to fight with renewed vigor to try and obtain the potential treasures. The more discerning people in the group realized that something was wrong, and they fled from the building. Since the crowd was already in chaos, no one tried to stop anyone from leaving. Their attention was already consumed by the developments in the basement. Suddenly, a viscous, translucent liquid gushed up from the depths of the basement. "What the hell is that?" someone yelled. A martial artist was caught off guard and ended up soaked in the stuff. He tried to shake it off, but the odd substance seemed to thicken and envelop him more. When he realized that the liquid was rising and wrapping itself around his legs, fear appeared in his eyes, and he began to shout for help. A paranormal summoned a fireball and attacked the sticky liquid, but the fire sank harmlessly into the substance and disappeared. "Since it's a liquid, we should use ice on it," someone suggested. A water-powered man tried to freeze it, but his attempts appeared to have no effect on it at all. Everyone wondered just what type of monster they had the misfortune of stumbling across. Every type of paranormal used their best attacks, but no matter how hard they tried, nothing seemed to affect the destructive liquid. Panicked cries soon rang out. "What is this? It's going everywhere! Don't touch it!" The Deathwater monster continued to gush up from the basement. It didn't flow like regular water, but appeared to wriggle forward eagerly as it consumed more people. The air was soon filled with the strangled cries of people being consumed by the terrifying substance. As the survivors realized it was a monster that was completely immune to both physical and paranormal attacks, they all felt a chill run down their spines. Those who were consumed by the monster were quickly reduced to bones, and then they disappeared. The survivors ran for their lives, knowing they were no match for the monster. There was a mad rush for the exit as they all scrambled away from the deadly liquid and fought to get to the front of the crowd. They knew that if they were the ones at the back, they would be the first to be devoured by the unknown entity. Those who hadn't fully realized the situation, and who didn't make it to the front, were quickly swallowed whole. When the military personnel in the camp nearby saw the mob fleeing from the base for no apparent reason, they were baffled. They wondered if Stellar Technology had a trump card capable of scaring that many people. An officer picked up his binoculars to try and get a closer look. Then he felt a drop of water in his hand. He looked up at the sky and saw that it was filled with ominous dark clouds. The sound of the rain woke Charles. Surprised, he walked out of his room and looked up at the watchtower in the distance. The residence was hidden behind a door of light, a mysterious atmosphere he had deliberately created to conceal the shocking trap he had prepared. He had taken every care so that the enemy would never suspect what he had done, but he knew the rain could interfere with his plans. When Miranda saw that Charles was awake, she rushed to his side, concern on her face. "It's so dark and cloudy," she said. "It looks like it's going to rain for a few days." If the rain didn't stop soon, they wouldn't be able to launch a fire attack as they had planned. Even without the rain, the fire attack wasn't very likely to succeed anyway. The zombies had only appeared after the Stellar Technology soldiers had been defeated. It was clearly a calculated move to have the zombies surround the survival base. No matter which direction the Alliance members went from the base, they would be ambushed. They had to be extra cautious and over-prepare. Charles looked at Miranda, his eyes full of sorrow. "You must be exhausted from last night," he said. He wasn't talking about physical fatigue, but about a weariness of the soul. Though it had only been one night, she looked like she hadn't slept for a week. Miranda said lightly, "Some of the men couldn't take it anymore and decided to release their frustrations on the women. I'll kill them." She said it matter-of-factly, but Charles could hear the fury behind her words. There were nearly 50,000 people in the Dawn Alliance. The men outnumbered the women because of the incidents that kept happening, especially at night. Miranda had lost track of how many women had died because of all the violence against them, and she had taken it upon herself to exact revenge for their deaths. "Thank you for your hard work," Charles said, not knowing what else to say. Miranda shook her head. "I'm not the one who's working the hardest." "Go sleep for a while," he said gently. "We have things to do later. But for now, we need to recover some of our strength so we can kill the zombies." She frowned, wondering if they should really go out and attack in this weather, but she only nodded silently. Charles called over Alice, who had been lying down. "Watch over Miranda. I'm going out for a bit. Alice helped an extremely exhausted Miranda get into bed. Meanwhile, Charles walked to the center of the survival base, where he had hidden the core of the Dawn Alliance's defense. Olivia came up behind him and said, "I thought you'd sleep a little longer. Did this rain wake you up early?" She hadn't found him there by chance. The people she had sent to protect Charles had informed her as soon as he had woken up. Such strict surveillance was necessary for his safety, but since he was constantly on one mission or another, it had become more difficult for her to keep an eye on him. Charles nodded. "The formation protecting the Alliance has a lot of secret uses. I'll show you one of them." As he spoke, he pressed his hands to the ground. A large pit appeared and continued to expand. Olivia watched, somewhat puzzled as she tried to figure out what he was trying to do. She looked up and found that the energy shield above them had started to leak water. The energy shield rose to 100 feet above them to protect them against flying mutated insects and paranormal aerial attacks, since those were harder to defend against than enemies on the ground. If the shield was leaking water, she wondered if that meant it had already been damaged. The thought troubled her. She opened her mouth to ask Charles about it, but he read her mind. "When I was designing the energy shield above us, I deliberately left an arc in it, sort of like a funnel," he explained. "It can be closed at any time, of course. Now we can use this place as a reservoir to catch rainwater." Olivia furrowed her brow. "But we shouldn't run out of water in this neck of the woods." Although water was still very valuable, it wasn't quite as precious as food, and they were only 20 miles from the river. As strong as the martial artists were, it didn't even take an hour to carry a few tons of water from the river to the base. If they really wanted to reduce their worry, they could dig a canal, which would take 50 paranormals only a day to do. "I'm talking about clean water," Charles said, pointing up at the energy shield. "I put a dragon pearl up there to purify the water before it's transported down. Later I'll also put a dragon pearl in the reservoir. I'll have to set someone to watch over it." Even if the rainwater was purified once, there was no guarantee that it wouldn't be contaminated again after entering the reservoir. That was why he wanted to put 2 forms of protection over it to ensure the water was absolutely safe to drink. In the future, water pollution would become a serious problem. He had designed this system to safeguard their future. Olivia was silent for a moment. "Actually," she said slowly, "I noticed it already. I just pretended not to see it." Charles continued to expand the water pit. "Why is that?" he asked. "I was curious about the design, but after yesterday, I realized it was all part of your foresight," she replied. He ignored the flattery and kept his eyes on the ground. "What else?" She looked around carefully. Once she was sure no one was around, she said, "You're in a place that has plenty of water, and yet you're preparing for a drought. We'll need more water in the future, won't we?" The rain started to pour harder, hitting the energy shield heavily and waking many people from their dreams. Charles hesitated for a few seconds before finally admitting, "Yes, we will." He didn't explain further, nor did he tell her why he knew what would happen in the future. He couldn't let anyone find out his secret, and he didn't owe anyone an explanation in the first place. Olivia's eyes held a trace of sadness as she said, "I understand." The next day, the sky was a bit brighter, but it was still raining heavily. Everyone in the Dawn Alliance had noticed the reservoir in the center of the survival base. Olivia explained that this reservoir had appeared to help them in case the zombies laid siege to the base. Nobody was suspicious of this explanation. Although they already had the spirit spring, they thought that the more preparations they made for times of hardship, the better, so the Alliance members were happy about the reservoir. The only problem was that it made them even more afraid of the zombies waiting outside. Kevin had originally wanted to use himself as bait to lure the zombies to the traps Charles had set up, but he looked at the heavy rain outside and sighed. "I don't think that'll be possible now," he thought. Even if he led the zombies into the traps, the fire wouldn't be able to burn them. The traps were useless in the rain. Lena's heart was troubled by the complicated situation. She wanted the zombies outside to be destroyed, but she didn't want Kevin or her brother to risk their lives in the process. She knew she couldn't have it both ways, but she couldn't help worrying about it nevertheless. In the conference room, Robert leaned back in his chair, his face full of despair. "Looks like our fire tactics won't work. We'll have to wait for the rain to stop," he said. Everyone nodded. With all the rain, not only were fire-powered paranormals weakened, but the number of soldiers who could fight was also limited. If they were to start a fight with the zombies now, the odds wouldn't be in the Alliance's favor. Alex looked at Charles expectantly. "Have you thought of a plan?" he asked. Everyone turned to Charles with the same anticipatory look. No one knew when exactly they had come to rely on him completely, but they all felt as if there was no problem they couldn't solve as long as he was there. He seemed to have an answer for everything, even situations that seemed impossible. "Yes," Charles said crisply. "We're going to go out and kill all the zombies." They were all taken aback by his simple response. A few of them nearly choked in surprise. Mark's eyes lit up. "You're right, of course. It's just a few monsters, isn't it? That should be no problem for us. We can take them on even if we're outnumbered." His favorite plans were the ones that used force, but not all the others agreed. After some thought, Taylor said, "But we still don't have very many paranormals. We might not have enough to defeat the zombies." In small battles, humans were generally not very afraid of zombies, but in a fight as large as this one would surely be. The humans were at a disadvantage. "I really want to go along with this plan," Kevin said, "but is there a way to reduce the number of casualties it'll result in?" He wasn't afraid to die, if necessary. Otherwise, he wouldn't have volunteered as bait. But if he had to die, he hoped his death would be worth something. "This isn't just some foolish scheme," Olivia pointed out. "Yesterday afternoon before the rain, 75% of the shield's energy was consumed in 12 hours. But in the 7 hours after the rain, less than 12% was used." Alex's eyes widened in understanding. "You mean the rain weakens the zombies and reduces their strength?" A glimmer of hope shone in everyone's eyes. If that was true, then that was good news for them. Charles added, "In this storm, whatever's leading the zombies has less control over them. But even so, there won't be very many people willing to leave the base to go kill zombies," Jason piped up. Most people weren't willing to go out in such heavy rain, let alone fight zombies. And judging by the thickness of the clouds, the stormy weather probably wouldn't end anytime soon. Charles said quietly, "Those who are willing to go fight will follow me. Those who aren't willing will stay. Tina, go see how many people are willing to leave the base. Of course, if they're not willing to fight now, then they shouldn't plan on following me in the future." He was talking about the group of nearly 200 people who had followed him from the beginning. He had given them so much, now it was time for them to choose who they would follow. At the very least, their weapons would give them an advantage. But he knew that even if he gave them all the very best equipment, not everyone knew how to appreciate it. Some of them hadn't paid much attention during training. Tina nodded. "Okay, I'll go now." She left, taking Hugh and Tommy with her to help count the people who were willing to fight. Charles said to Olivia, "I won't bring too many people with me when I leave the base to hunt the zombies. If your subordinates want to go out as well, they can be in the second group and can help cover our retreat if we get into too much danger." Olivia nodded. He turned to the deputy chiefs. "If any of your subordinates want to go out, lead them in a different direction than my group. Otherwise, it'll be too dangerous. I can't watch over everybody." The deputy chiefs looked at him, suddenly questioning their own value. Each of them was strong and had many people under their command, but in such a dangerous situation, none of them were worth as much as Charles was. They wondered if he would abandon them if they became worthless to the Alliance. They'd never dared to let themselves think about that before, but now it had become a real worry. Charles didn't care about their thoughts. He was more concerned about the number of people who would fight with them. In the end, 166 of the 195 original followers dared to leave the base to kill the zombies, and the rest of them chose to stay behind. He said nothing to those who stayed. It was their choice. If they stayed now, they might avoid risking their lives, but their futures were in their own hands. Those under Miranda's command all chose to leave the base to fight, but this wasn't that surprising because they had all fought alongside her not long after the apocalypse had begun. 127 more people decided to fight the zombies under Mark's command. At Charles's request, Kevin picked only 36 people from his subordinates. Charles didn't want to send too many people out because it would leave the base vulnerable to attack. Everyone form groups of 12 people and number yourselves within the group. Charles instructed the people who were going out to fight the zombies. If number 1 dies, follow number 2. And if number 2 dies, follow number 3, and so on. There should never be a time when no one is in charge. After that, he went on, each team will receive a number plate indicating your team's number, from 1 to 26. When I give the order, each group's number will be announced, so pay attention. Not all of the 26 teams were full. Some only had 11 people, but that wasn't a big deal. They could still fight with one person missing. After all the groups had been arranged, more than 300 people walked out of the survival base through the underground gate. Each of them was wearing a raincoat, and Charles had upgraded everyone's weapons. As they watched the soldiers leave the base, the deputy chiefs who were staying behind exchanged helpless looks and wondered what they should do. Alex smiled bitterly and said, "I have thought about trying to seize power at one point. Now that I think about it, the idea is really ridiculous." "Exactly," Jason said. "If anyone wants to become the Alliance leader, they have to do what Charles is doing now." "But is that even possible?" Alex asked. Countless members of the Dawn Alliance watched the soldiers marching out in their raincoats. Some of them had fanatical looks in their eyes, wishing that they could be among that group, and jealous of the soldiers' courage to leave the base. And some of them were filled with hatred that these soldiers had gotten better weapons just because they'd been willing to follow Charles into battle. A man in the crowd of onlookers said, "Going out there is a death sentence. Those zombies will kill them all right away." Beside him, a woman said sharply, "I'd like to see how many of these people come back alive." Perhaps it was because they were all in a tight group, but the people around them began to echo their sentiments. "They're risking their lives just to get a good knife. What idiots!" "Just you watch, the zombies will leave on their own soon enough. These people are doomed." The surrounding people all looked at these detractors with disdain, and Olivia marched up to them looking murderous. "You," she barked at them. "What are you all talking about?" The woman with the sharp voice wasn't afraid of the deputy mayor's anger. "What? Do you think I'm wrong? Surely the Alliance leader and a few paranormals are strong enough to take out these zombies. Why should they let ordinary people go out and risk their lives? Why put them in harm's way?" "Are you done?" Olivia asked, narrowing her eyes. "Why?" the woman asked. "Are you going to punish me for speaking out?" She had barely finished her sentence before there was a sharp slash across her body, and she collapsed to the ground. Even in death, her face was still filled with disgust. The longsword in Olivia's hand danced again. In the space of a breath, she had killed all the dissenters, not even giving them a chance to beg for mercy. Everyone else in the crowd was filled with terror at Olivia's show of strength. They had known she must have had great management skills to oversee 10,000 people in the Alliance, but they hadn't expected her to deal out death so quickly and decisively. Olivia sheathed her blade and said to the silent crowd, "Those zombies outside threaten all our lives. No matter Charles's reason for taking these people out there, they're protecting everyone in the Alliance." Everyone averted their eyes in shame. After Charles's performance the day before, they were afraid of him, but despite their fear, they knew he did everything he could to protect them. Olivia continued, "I know what you're thinking, that the people I just killed were only speaking their opinion and shouldn't have been sentenced to death. But the way I see it, they were insulting the heroes who are risking their lives to protect us all." The crowd shifted uncomfortably, their shame only intensifying. The soldiers who had just left to hunt down the zombies were doing it to secure a future for the Alliance, and these people had stood by while the detractors had insulted those heroes. They felt horrible. Alex addressed them next. "In the old days, it might have been okay to criticize the heroes who shed blood and tears for you, but that's in the past, and a new order is being established. If anyone dares to speak out against those who protect us, there's only one thing they deserve, and that's death." Jason stood up and added, "No one can insult a hero in front of us without paying the price." Taylor and Robert also announced that they agreed with Olivia's actions. Charles didn't know about the small skirmish that had just happened in the survival base. He was already too far away to hear anything. But even if he had known and had returned, he would have agreed that the only way to deal with the detractors was the death penalty. There was no room for reconciliation, and they would not have been given a chance to defend themselves. The deputy chiefs understood why these people cowered in the face of danger, but there was no excuse for them to recklessly curse those who were brave enough to face their enemies. Even if the soldiers hadn't been fighting to protect the people, those who accepted their kindness couldn't do anything to insult them. Perhaps the dissenters had only said what they had said to hide their inner weakness and cowardice. But it didn't matter if they had spoken without malice, because the impact of their words had been considerable. If they had been allowed to spread their opinions, then the number of people willing to fight against the enemy would have decreased. They were unwilling to chance being stabbed in the back by friends while facing the enemy unnecessarily. In the deputy chief's eyes, these people only seemed to want to hurt others. After the soldiers left the survival base, countless zombies lunged at them, baring their fangs and brandishing their claws. But Kevin heaved a sigh of relief. Only the zombies within 100 feet are attacking us. It seems like this rain has had a big impact on them after all. Miranda hunched in her raincoat and let out a breath. You're right. Maybe we really can kill all these zombies. Charles nodded. Then he issued an order through each team's number plate. Teams 1 through 5, head to the left. 6 through 10, head to the right. Go straight and remember to support each other. Teams 11 to 15, head to the front. The rest of you are behind us. Although Charles's voice crackling through the number plates startled them, everyone followed his orders. Then Charles's gaze fell on a tentacled monster not far away. It's a tentacular cadaver! Someone shouted. Just as some Stellar Technology soldiers were about to escape the tentacular cadaver, Charles saw the monster on the city wall. It easily lifted a huge vehicle carrying more than 20 people and smashed it back into the ground. The people inside were zombie food now. Of course, Charles didn't feel the least bit sorry for the Stellar Technology soldiers. He was just afraid of the tentacular cadaver. He knew that this monster had 3 unique powers that made it a formidable foe. The first threat was its tentacles, usually 2 or more, which were incredibly strong and extremely flexible. They could easily find and attack gaps in any armor. It was impossible to guard against them. The second power was its ability to command zombies. Although with the heavy rain still pouring down and driving them away, there weren't many zombies left for it to command. The third power was regeneration. Not only could it rapidly regrow its tentacles, but it could even transfer its life force into another zombie's body after killing that zombie. In less than 3 seconds, it would become a new tentacular cadaver. That regenerative ability was precisely why the tentacular cadaver was so frightening, and why it would take a whole group of people to take it down. In Charles's past life, when a super squad had encountered a tentacular cadaver, they'd always completely surrounded it to destroy it. Miranda, do you see that tentacular cadaver in the distance? Charles asked. He pointed his short sword at the tentacular cadaver nearby, then he pointed it at what seemed to be an ordinary zombie, but was really another tentacular cadaver with its tentacles hidden at its waist. There are 2 here, and they can regenerate over and over again. So if you want to kill one, you have to kill all the zombies around it as well, he warned. Their tentacles are very powerful. It'd only take 1 blow to kill a level 3 martial artist. It's impossible for one person alone to kill it, even if they're on their guard. If any ordinary people face it, they'll be going to their deaths. I'll bring a group around to cut off the tentacular cadavers from the outlying zombies, he went on. But I think Miranda will be the best one to deal a fatal blow to the tentacular cadavers. Kevin, you're responsible for keeping her safe and preventing any accidents. Try to protect her and the others as much as possible. Charles might not have cared much about other people's lives, but he was good to his own people. Even people like Hank tolerated him as long as he didn't cross any lines. These soldiers with him were very valuable in battle. Any casualties would weaken his overall strength in the future. Kevin nodded. I understand. He was a warrior, and his skills were second only to Charles's. If someone needed protecting in battle, he was the best choice. Compared to paranormals of the same level, he would have been considered weak if he had relied solely on his own strength. But his strength had increased rapidly after he had obtained the Crimson Flame Sword. This weapon was why in the Dawn Alliance, only Charles was stronger than him. And the reason he hadn't broken through to level 5 wasn't that he wasn't talented enough. It was that he'd been taking the time to comprehend the profundities of every minor realm, opening up a path for all living beings and reducing the risk of injury or death for others during their cultivation practices. Miranda nodded too. I'll do my best to kill these tentacular cadavers, she promised. She established a connection with her blood-drinking sword, which substantially increased her strength. She felt like she was only a sliver away from level 5. But recently, she hadn't had very many chances to participate in battle, which would help her break through. Remember, the tentacular cadaver's tentacles can regenerate, so be careful, Charles reminded her. Then he turned to the people behind him. Team 16 to 26, follow me, don't fall behind. After giving the order, he rushed off to the left. The soldiers didn't dare ignore him, so they immediately ran after him. While they moved forward, Charles issued more orders through their number plates. Each team of 12 is divided into 4 groups of 3, that should be positioned in the front, back, left, and right. When you meet a zombie, separate into these groups and surround it. Work together to take it down. The 3 in the middle retreat, and the 3 in the back pursue. The 6 on the left and right move forward quickly to flank the enemy and make a triangular pincer formation. Charles's words were transmitted to every team's number plate. As soon as they heard his instructions, they adjusted their formations. None of them thought they were smart enough to ignore his advice. In such a dangerous environment, anyone who spoke with enough confidence would quickly gain a lot of people's trust. When people were out of their minds with fear, it was easiest to focus their attention on someone else, so they followed Charles's guidance as if it would lead them to precious treasure. Even those who had just joined the Alliance and didn't have a high opinion of Charles completely obeyed his orders because they knew they were still outsiders. If they fell out of line during battle, no one on their team would forgive them. Just as Charles was leading his group around to cut the enemy off, a member of Team 1 suddenly slipped and fell to the ground. It wasn't surprising, given how muddy and slippery the ground was because of the rain. He looked up and saw a pair of white eyes. It was a zombie he had just struck to the ground a moment before, but it hadn't died. The soldier's miserable cry rang out as the zombie bit him. He was the first person to be injured. As they looked down at the scarlet blood mixing with the mud, the soldier's team fell into chaos. "Quick, save him! Do you have any zombie serum?" But he had been bitten in the neck. There was no saving him. The zombie serum wasn't all-powerful. If someone was bitten in an artery or near the brain, the infection was too quick to stop, and it was impossible to save them. They were already lost. Miranda shouted, "Don't try to help him. Prepare for the surrounding zombies to attack." But her warning was already too late. Just as another soldier instinctively reached out his hand to pull up his injured teammate, a short zombie launched itself at the soldier, wrapped its thin limbs tightly around the man's upper body, and bit down on his neck. The man screamed violently, and the rest of the team began to panic. Miranda was about to step forward when Kevin put a hand on her shoulder and said, "I'll go." Miranda nodded. She had more important tasks to do. She couldn't afford to be distracted by something so trivial. With the enemy they were facing, a handful of lives was an insignificant loss. It wasn't that she didn't find these people's lives valuable, but she had a greater responsibility to save everyone, not just a few. Kevin had brought 36 people, but they didn't stay with him. Instead, they followed Charles's core team. Their greatest use now was as reinforcements if the soldiers on any other teams fell. The zombies were no match for Kevin with his Crimson Flame sword. He swung it dispassionately, dispatching them as quickly as possible. By the time he had killed the last one in their area, 5 soldiers had already died. He gathered the rest of the soldiers and said gruffly, "The next time someone slips, stay back and leave them there." A woman yelled at him, "We shouldn't have come out here to hunt these zombies now. It's raining and the ground is muddy and too slippery. You brought us out here to die needlessly. Do you even care about our lives?" Kevin brushed off her accusation. "Anyone who thinks they can't fight under these conditions can go back to the base. I won't blame you. But if you stay and fight, don't put your teammates at risk." The woman raised her arms and shouted at the people around her. "Did you hear that? He doesn't care about our lives. He expects us to fight while also making sure not to slip in the mud. Is that even possible?" The only answer she got was the sound of the rain. She frowned in confusion, wondering how they weren't afraid. It was already very risky for them to come out and face the zombies in such ghastly weather, but now they also had to be mindful of the mud beneath their feet and keep themselves from slipping. She wasn't sure how they could fight under such harsh conditions. Another woman pointed at teams 6 to 10, which were fighting nearby, and asked, "Do you think they don't also have to deal with the mud? Why are you the only one who gets to complain?" The woman who had protested watched the teams battle the zombies endlessly. The zombies kept coming, and yet they also kept dying under the soldiers' blades. She felt guilty for complaining, but she also felt a bit inadequate too. It wasn't as if only a couple of them had the special ability to keep their footing in the mud. All of them were fighting without slipping. What's going on? She wondered. How are they able to do that? Someone shouted, "It's because of the training Charles gave us." Everyone's eyes sparkled as they remembered. Most of the people present had been trained by Charles. They had fought on the glass bridge high above the ground, and those who had failed had fallen into the pit full of glass shards. Those who had been able to control their soul energy had reduced the amount of damage they had received. But those who hadn't been able to had had to use tweezers to remove the slivers of glass that had been embedded in their skin. The pain had been so unbearable that just thinking about it now sent fresh chills down their spines. It was no wonder so few people had been willing to follow Charles out of the base. Many of them had given up during Charles's training, and if they couldn't even survive that, then they had no chance in this battle. The woman who had complained frowned in confusion. "What training?" she asked. No one answered her question because they were already too busy praising Charles. "I'd expect nothing less of the Alliance leader. He's always had such foresight." "That's right. Compared to fighting these brainless monsters, fighting on the glass bridge was much more dangerous. We shouldn't let a little mud scare us." "Yeah, I'm glad he started training us so early. The formation he had us make just now, is that? Shh! There are more zombies coming." Kevin's onslaught a few moments before had cleared the area around them, but it hadn't taken long for more zombies to start filling that void. When the soldiers faced them again, the zombies didn't seem that terrifying anymore. They had tough skin and solid bones, but the soldiers' long blades sliced through their flesh with little effort. And if they encountered a particularly vigorous zombie, a paranormal would come along and take care of it. Miranda's team had 8 paranormals, and they could take on any kind of enemy, especially since Hugh had broken through to a new level. During this battle, the soldiers gradually discovered the benefits of Charles's training. Compared to the slippery ground, the glass bridge had been a more dangerous environment, and they'd been fighting cunning humans on the glass bridge, not brainless zombies. Their blades were more than sufficient to deal with the danger. Charles hadn't given the best equipment to everyone, but he had put nail-sized Crimson Flame energy gems into many of the weapons. In his opinion, the objective power of a weapon was significantly less important than the talent of the person wielding it. As long as the soldiers had been trained right, having fancy weapons didn't matter. The more zombies the soldiers killed, the more they admired Charles's foresight. Just as he had planted traps with explosives and flammable items in advance, he had also adequately prepared for the battle at hand. The soldiers recognized that none of them could ever be as great a leader as Charles was, and they knew that following a powerful person like him was a good choice. It was easy for them to see the difference between themselves and the soldiers on Charles's team, who seemed completely unaffected by the harsh environment. They wanted to be strong enough to adapt to the terrain so easily, too. Being as strong as Charles, Miranda, or even Mark was an extravagant hope for them, but achieving the strength of Charles's team members was within their reach. This thought took root in their hearts, giving them the courage to keep fighting. While the battle was in full swing ahead of him, Charles led his group behind the enemy, issuing orders as he went. Teams 17 to 21, spread out from this spot. Teams 22 to 26, keep moving forward. Make sure you circle around. Team 16, follow me and kill every zombie you see. Team 16 had 12 people. This was the team he had been focusing on training the most. Now they were about to begin Charles's second test. One of the fighters had wanted to train her own team, and she thought Charles's apparent favoritism toward the people he had personally trained was unfair. Why can't he give us all a chance to fight alongside him? She thought. Then everyone would be happy to accept the outcome. Charles had chosen 12 fighters to follow him into battle. They were dressed in armor made from blue flame energy gems and held either two-handed swords or axes, both very heavy types of weapons. Blue flame energy gems were very malleable and couldn't be forged into sharp weapons. They weren't ideal for making armor, but they could be used to make mechanical arms, though Charles hadn't yet worked out how to craft such advanced machinery. However, the fighters' gem-infused armor was very flexible and didn't restrict their movement, allowing them enhanced mobility in battle. Explaining the armor to them, Charles said, "Weighing only 26 pounds, blue flame energy gem armor shouldn't feel too heavy, especially as your physical fitness has improved. Even though the armor isn't rigid, it's still very tough, and its special properties mean it can distribute the energy from a point of impact all over your body, reducing the risk of injury." The soldiers nodded to show they understood. This type of flexible armor was the best for fighting in the wilderness, and it was even more popular than chainmail. Charles didn't especially want to train these troops as heavy weapons specialists, but they were all very talented in combat and unafraid of death, so this type of warfare suited them very well. Once they passed this test, Charles would provide them with more suitable weapons. He gave the order to fight, and Mark slashed a level 4 zombie in half with a long axe. His axe sliced very easily through the zombie's body, and Mark weighed the axe in his hand, looking very satisfied. He said to Charles, "This is just the weapon I've always wanted. It's brilliant!" Charles replied, "I'll leave the battle to you, since you're so happy with your weapon." Mark patted his chest and said, "Leave it to me." He had been born with divine power and was an excellent fighter. He relished the chaos of battle and the opportunity to kill their enemies. With this fabulous weapon in my hands, everyone will see my divine power on full display, he thought. I'm one lucky guy. It wasn't long before Mark and his team had greatly reduced the number of zombies. The ground was littered with bodies. Usually that would have attracted the attention of any nearby zombies, because they would be able to smell all the spilled blood. But it was raining very heavily, so the zombies in the distance couldn't smell anything. Even though zombies could see as well as smell what was going on, they still relied heavily on their sense of smell to give them the details of a situation. From such a distance, they wouldn't see whether people were friend or foe, and so they were hesitant to approach. Mark congratulated his troops. Well done! We've only been fighting for a few minutes, and we've killed easily 1/3 of the zombies. This new armor is great, because we didn't have to worry about defending ourselves. We were able to concentrate on attacking. Watching how Mark's team had encircled the remaining zombies, Charles gave an order to Miranda. Your turn. She dashed forward, lashing out with a moon slash at great speed and lopping off the heads of 10 zombies. Not bothering to look at the other soldiers, she stared instead at the tentacular cadaver, screaming, "Die!" and calling on the Thunder Strike. Waving a sharp, conical energy sword before her, she quickly killed several more zombies that had been trying to defend the tentacular cadaver. Miranda stared the creature full in the face, unafraid to make eye contact. As if sensing a threat, it reacted by pushing 2 of its tentacles toward her. At the tip of each tentacle, there was a sharp gleaming point that looked as though it could cut through anything. Oh no you don't, thought Miranda. My blood-drinking sword will make short work of you. She raised the sword and swiped at the 2 tentacles, which started to wither. This blood-drinking sword is such a good weapon, she thought. It might have started out as just a sword that could absorb the enemy's blood, but I can make it absorb both blood and energy now. To be able to use the blood-drinking sword for both purposes required considerable skill, and that only came with a great deal of practice. Miranda was naturally talented and had practiced very hard, so she was one of the few soldiers who could pull off this technical move. The tentacular cadaver watched in horror as its 2 tentacles continued to wither so badly that there was barely anything left of them. They took 2 steps back, and some zombies blocked Miranda's path. "Get out of my way," she yelled fiercely. A pure white beam shone out from her hand, and with her blood-drinking sword, she dispatched the zombies that had blocked her way. The tentacular cadaver tried to retreat, but it was already too late. Miranda was right beside it, and she stabbed her sword between its eyes. This is odd, she thought. The moment her sword made contact, she realized that the soul energy of the tentacular cadaver should have felt like that of a level 5 monster, but it didn't. It feels weak, she thought. How can a level 5 zombie feel so weak? Just then, a zombie that was 5 yards away turned its hands into tentacles, and Miranda thought, it's just like Charles said, if you want to kill the tentacular cadaver, you have to kill the zombies around it as well. Miranda was an expert fighter with a lot of experience as well as knowledge. She had fought in hundreds of battles, and at school she had faced monsters that had been even more terrifying than the tentacular cadaver. So I just need to kill all the zombies, she thought. The tentacular cadaver had regenerated and was already threatening her again. But before it could adapt to its new body and transfer its life core, she swung her sword and the sharp blade hit the creature, piercing its core so quickly that it was helpless to defend itself. As she killed the tentacular cadaver, a powerful aura of energy burst from Miranda's body, surprising her and everyone around her. Watching Miranda slaughter the tentacular cadaver, everyone was surprised when they saw the energy aura burst from her body. They all realized that she had broken through to level 5. Before the battle, she had only been 1 step away from level 5, and having killed the level 5 tentacular cadaver, coupled with the effects of the blood-drinking sword, she had achieved her breakthrough. Feeling the abundant soul energy in her body, Miranda tensed the muscles of her left hand. There's no time to adapt gradually now, Charles said. If we were in the middle of a battle, you could take your time and acclimatize to your new level. But there's a second tentacular cadaver that needs your attention. The second tentacular cadaver didn't seem to have any tentacles. He just looked like an ordinary zombie. But as Charles had said, it was a tentacular cadaver. Miranda had no doubt that he was correct. His knowledge of monsters was far greater than anyone else's, and she trusted his judgment. She raised her blood-drinking sword again, but just as she was about to kill the second tentacular cadaver, Charles called out to her, "Behind you." She spun around and cut off 2 of the tentacular cadaver's tentacles. Meanwhile, the original tentacular cadaver's host body had turned into a dried-up corpse. Miranda realized what had happened. It must have been able to transfer its life core to another body just as I killed it, she said. It sacrificed its original body and used its regenerative powers to transfer into one of the other zombies. She was shocked by what had happened. If it hadn't been for Charles's reminder, she could have been seriously injured, or worse. Level 5 zombies can be intelligent, Charles said. It may not be intelligence as we typically know it, but they can be clever and cunning. Don't ever forget that. He looked at the creature's withered corpse on the ground. The fact that the tentacular cadaver can transfer its life core to another body and devour that new host gives it a major advantage, he went on. In a group battle, it can protect its own life over and over again. Unless the entire group dies, there will always be another host available to it. But that could be a weakness too, can't it? Said Miranda. When it meets an opponent who can kill it quickly enough, it won't have time to transfer its life core to another. Charles interrupted her and shouted, "It's attacking again. Kill it!" Miranda fearlessly ran through the piles of corpses and aimed at the tentacular cadaver's new body. It had already regenerated its 2 missing tentacles, and this time, it didn't attack her directly. Instead, it pierced the heads of 2 nearby zombies with its tentacles and disappeared. "Which one did it go into?" shouted Charles, realizing that the tentacular cadaver had abandoned its body once again and had parasitized another new host. Miranda knew she had very little time to determine which zombie the creature had gone into, and if she chose the wrong target, she would be in great danger. I know what I have to do, she thought. I'll tune into my blood-drinking sword. Feeling her sword pointing her in a specific direction, she knew it had targeted her deadly enemy. Her eyes shone brightly as she followed the direction of the sword's energy. It's the tentacular cadaver, she thought. It tried to be sneaky and trick me with its odd behavior, but it can't hide from me anymore. Rushing toward the tentacular cadaver, Miranda's mind flashed back to previous fights with zombies on her way to Montreal, when she had fought bravely, but had underestimated the monstrous' intelligence. Now I know better, she thought, and this one is very clever. I won't let my guard down again. Even though Miranda hadn't had enough time since she had broken through to level 5 to properly adapt to her new abilities, she had already become even faster and stronger. She swiftly pierced through the tentacular cadaver's body and could sense its life force dwindling away. She smiled as she realized she had bet on the right monster and hit the target. Suddenly, a sword energy beam whizzed past her. After turning around, she saw that Charles was standing nearby with his sword in his hand and had lopped off 2 more tentacles that had sprung out from another zombie. "What's going on?" Miranda asked. "I got the right one, didn't I?" "It's my fault," replied Charles, sounding unusually ashamed. "I didn't expect it to be a puppet master." A tentacular cadaver's powers were weakened by stormy weather, but a puppet master was a different proposition altogether. Puppet masters were a mutation of the tentacular cadaver, and they could produce tentacles continuously by absorbing energy. On top of that, they had the ability to turn other zombies into their puppets. If a puppet master's original body was killed, it would use the body of one of its puppets as its new body. Charles hadn't expected to see a puppet master so soon after the apocalypse, and he knew they were even harder to kill than tentacular cadavers. A single puppet master with a few hundred zombies had the capacity to break into a survival base. Even a base like the Dawn Alliance's fortress could suffer serious damage from a puppet master attack. Why is there a puppet master here? He wondered. They're very rare, and I thought there had to be certain environmental conditions for one to appear. What's changed here? What don't we know? But he cast these doubts aside as quickly as they had arisen. I guess it doesn't matter, he thought. Whatever the reason it's here now, we need to kill it, or the whole of the Dawn Alliance will be in grave danger. After the puppet master had been attacked by Charles and had lost some of its tentacles, it didn't rush to regenerate them. Instead, it ordered the surrounding zombies to attack Charles. Charles said to Miranda, "The puppet master is very cunning, but if we can kill it, the zombies will probably disperse. They usually need a strong leader to keep them fighting, and without their puppet master, they won't know what to do. Kill the puppet master, and we deal with the zombie threat at the same time. If there's a supply of food nearby, the zombies will hang around to eat it, won't they?" she asked. "If I put myself out there as bait, they'll stay here and we can kill them all." "Do you think it's right for a level 5 paranormal like you to be bait?" said Charles, smiling. "I don't mind being the bait," Miranda replied. "The puppet master is intelligent. It'll know I'm a level 5 threat." "You came here to kill zombies," said Charles. "So let's kill all of them. and then the Puppet Master won't have any zombies left to parasitize when we attack it. Miranda nodded in agreement, and they started to massacre the zombies, quickly killing a large number of them. One zombie let out a mighty roar as Charles fired an ice arrow into its forehead. It had been trying to organize the other zombies into a fighting force, so Charles was delighted to have killed it. He and Miranda continued their slaughter, and the piles of dead zombies grew and grew. "Keep going," yelled Charles, watching Miranda with admiration. "They don't stand a chance against you." Other fighters from the Dawn Alliance base joined the massacre, some slipping in the mud and falling victim to the zombies. But overall, the Dawn Alliance casualties were light, and mainly consisted of junior ranks who had had little training. Charles stood back from the main battle, happy that Miranda had it under control. He needed to plan the next stage, and his thoughts turned to zombie serums in case they were needed for his troops. "We've got a good supply of all the mass-produced batches," he thought. "And I have my special supply from my parents, but the serums aren't foolproof. They can only strengthen our ability to resist the virus. If a zombie strikes a vital body part, the serums won't be effective enough. And then there's the issue of higher-level zombie attacks needing better-quality serums extracted from zombie spinal cords. Perhaps we ought to collect some spinal cords when this is over." It was fortunate that the Dawn Alliance fighters were all in very good shape and physically fit, giving them a degree of natural resistance to zombie viruses. They could withstand shallow scratches, so only serious injuries needed serum treatment. Turning his attention back to the battle, Charles used his soul energy to sense the movements of the zombies. It became clear that Miranda had led a brilliant campaign and had killed many zombies herself, and still they were dropping dead on the ground. At this rate, it would only take a short time until the Puppet Master had no target hosts left to parasitize. But it wasn't impossible that it would counterattack before it realized the desperation of its situation. Charles decided it was time to rejoin the battle and help Miranda finish off the Puppet Master. He saw one zombie cut off another zombie's head and throw it some distance away. Charles knew that even if a zombie lost its head, it wouldn't die immediately. It would slowly dry up and only die once it was completely dehydrated. Charles wondered if one of these zombies was actually a tentacular cadaver, or the Puppet Master living inside a new host. But just as the zombie head flew past him, Charles realized that if the Puppet Master was living inside another zombie, it would be nearly impossible to find. "What if it's inside the loose zombie head?" he thought, his eyes widening. "Ice Wall Amulet, Explosive Flame Amulet," he shouted, raising his hand to let fly the two amulets. He knew it was risky to use the two together, as one could counteract the other if the timing of their release wasn't perfect. But if he got it right, their joint power would be phenomenal. The loose zombie head quickly shattered into a cluster of fragments. Even the heavy rain from the huge thunderstorm raging throughout the battlefield couldn't extinguish the explosive flame amulet. But when Charles shot down the zombie head, 4 new heads appeared in the hands of 2 nearby zombies, 2 for each zombie. The zombies flung the 4 heads in different directions. "Nice try," Charles muttered under his breath, "but you're done for." He shook his left hand and 4 glass beads appeared between his fingers. He flicked his wrist, and the beads flew toward the 4 zombie heads and exploded violently. Each bead was made from blue flame energy gems, encompassing extract amulets within them. The glass was just a carrier material. The beads' real power came from the amulets inside them. When Charles had shot down the 4 heads, Miranda ran over to the 2 zombies. Raising her blood-drinking sword, she slashed downward with huge force, killing both of the zombies. There were no more zombies within about 30 yards. "At last, we finished them off," said Miranda, with a huge sigh of relief. But then she and Charles heard a terrible scream and spun around to see what was happening. A Dawn Alliance fighter was holding her throat, barely able to move. Around her neck was a tentacle, and its sharply pointed end pierced her temple. "Oh no," exclaimed Charles. "Surely the Puppet Master can't still be alive." Most monsters only existed to kill and eat human beings. That was the only way they knew how to live, and the threat they posed to the human race was so serious as to be fundamental. But the Puppet Master was no ordinary monster. It had decapitated a zombie and had thrown its head across the battlefield in a last-ditch effort to survive when it had sensed it had been about to lose the battle. If it's smart enough to do something like that, that's a terrifying prospect, thought Charles. It could continue to evolve and become an enormous threat to the whole of humanity. What a nightmare. It'll certainly be a major threat to the Dawn Alliance if it's allowed to live. And then what? If the Dawn Alliance is taken down by this terrible monster, who will protect the people? I have to kill it. Of the 3 greatest threats to the human race, zombies were the most dangerous. Mutated insects and wild animals could threaten people, but their main instinct was to satisfy their hunger. They only killed for food unless they were threatened, so they rarely killed people once they were full. But zombies were a completely different matter. Their evolutionary process had been different, and their only instinct was to kill, to devour life, to continuously absorb the soul energy between heaven and earth. That instinct strengthened as zombies grew and became physically stronger. Some zombies had a basic level of intelligence, but they were typically never a match for human beings in terms of brain power. But very rarely, a zombie's intelligence developed at an early age, their version of a child prodigy, and then they were very dangerous. The Puppet Master was one such zombie. Seeing what was happening to their fighters, Miranda and Charles ran to help them. The fighters had watched in horror as their comrade had succumbed to the tentacle wrapped around her neck, and they all wanted revenge. But before the Alliance fighters could use the weapons in their hands, tentacles strangled them and tore their throats. Watching her comrades die one by one, Miranda saw red. My students, she thought in horror. My poor students. They're all zombies now, and what can I do but kill them? This is just terrible. As she attacked her former pupils, she swore to herself that she would never let something like this happen again. The Puppet Master saw Miranda rushing toward it and stretched out its tentacles. Very clearly, it was no match for her now that she had reached level 5. Only by escaping could the Puppet Master have any chance of survival, and only by surviving would have any chance of a future. Some of the zombies who had previously been Miranda's students started attacking her, their eyes turning white as they ran at her. She killed them quickly even in her distress at their fate, and then she chased after the Puppet Master, completely careless of her own safety and her desire to avenge her comrades. The Puppet Master ran toward a rock, where it wrapped its tentacles around it and pulled itself in half. Ripping its top half into many pieces and flinging them far and wide, it entered a group of zombies, parasitizing all of them at once. What on earth is it doing now? Thought Miranda. As she and Charles had thought earlier, the Puppet Master could keep on transferring itself to new host after new host, and now it seemed to several all at once. Surely I'll be able to finish off this evil monster when it runs out of zombie hosts, she thought. Just as she drew close enough to attack, stone pillars with a layer of invisible power between them rose up from the ground like a cage around the Puppet Master. Charles ran over to Miranda when he saw what was happening. He was feeling murderous because the monster had killed so many of his troops. But as he looked at the caged creature, he said to Miranda, "Is this the real Puppet Master? It could just be a doppelganger. It's clever enough that it could make a duplicate that only looks like itself, but isn't really. Did the real Puppet Master actually escape? It's cunning, but there's one way we can know for sure." He summoned up some insect scales which settled on his upturned palms. Looking like throwing knives, they quickly took the lives of several zombies, until there remained only one in the stone pillar cage. Miranda was just about to make a move when Charles stopped her. "This one's mine," he said. "I want to be sure I can kill it." Miranda was surprised, but trusting Charles's judgment as always, she stayed still, but on her guard. If there was the slightest movement from the Puppet Master, she would attack straight away. Charles wielded his sword and chopped the parasitized zombie in half. Only the head that was left could sustain life. Then a 5-colored pentagram appeared beside the Puppet Master's host body. The spell array trapped the Puppet Master, which let out a shrill roar. Charles took out a clean dagger and cut a line on his left hand. His blood flowed from it and entered the spell array. Then he shouted, "Soul-devouring rat of the hellish ocean, in the name of the ancient contract, I call on you now." The spell array was activated, and a rat-like monster materialized out of the light. Then, one after another, many more rodent-like beasts appeared and devoured the Puppet Master. After that, the rat monsters ran toward a Dawn Alliance soldier on the ground who had been turned into a zombie. The Dawn Alliance fighters were about to pounce on the rats when Charles shouted, "Stop! Stop right now! The soul-devouring rats are searching for the Puppet Master's aura. It must have already parasitized that soldier." Looking in horror at the rats swarming over their comrade's body, they all stood still at Charles's order as the dead soldier slowly opened his eyes. Seeing their dead comrade opening his eyes, the Dawn Alliance fighters went on their guard. But the dead soldier soon stopped breathing as the soul-devouring rats crawled across his body and the bodies of his dead comrades. The rats didn't seem to have any intention of eating the dead bodies, which puzzled the onlookers, and the rats returned to Charles's side once all the corpses had stopped breathing. Charles explained to his fighters, "They're soul-devouring rats from the hellish ocean, and they feed on soul energy. There's nothing for you to worry about. They're the best way of killing a puppet master." The Dawn Alliance fighters dropped their guard and marveled at Charles's knowledge. They had seen powerful people before, and they had worked with experts, but they had never come across anyone like Charles before, who combined power, expertise, and astonishing battle skills so effectively. "Isn't he great?" said one fighter to his comrade. "He's amazing," came the reply. "Aren't we lucky to be able to follow such a brilliant leader?" "Yeah," said the first fighter. "We're good fighters, but we don't have his wisdom and experience yet. But we will given time. And then we'll be powerhouses like he is," replied his comrade. But now wasn't the time to celebrate. "Pull yourselves together," ordered Charles. "I know you've had a rough day, but we need to kill as many zombies as we can. And wait until any stragglers have dispersed before you take the crystal cores." As he was giving his orders, Charles saw Miranda take up a defensive stance and wondered fleetingly what she was doing. Then he realized there must be danger behind him. Using his special powers, he swept his soul energy behind himself and saw that his spell array still hadn't stopped shining. Then a thick fog appeared, and out of it came a giant creature with 3 heads. The monster emitted a powerful aura, making many of the Dawn Alliance fighters feel shivers down their spines. Feeling alarmed and uncertain what to do, they looked to their leaders for guidance. Kevin clenched his crimson flame sword tightly in his hand, unsure whether it was rain or sweat running down his forehead. Seeing Charles's shocked expression, Kevin knew he must have called on this creature by accident. "What the hell is that thing?" Kevin wondered. "I've never seen such a destructive aura." "You again," blurted Charles. "What are you doing here?" The Dawn Alliance fighters were surprised to see that Charles seemed to know this huge 3-headed monster. Miranda, Anthony, and the others also looked bewildered. The last time Charles had showed off his summoning ceremony in front of them, this same monster, a beast he had named Cerberus, had appeared. Cerberus roared loudly. "I should be asking you that. You've summoned the prey that I've been hunting for the last 3 days. What am I supposed to eat? Do you want me to starve?" Charles rubbed his nose awkwardly and coughed, saying, "I didn't expect you to answer my summons. It was a coincidence that I called on the soul-devouring rats just as you were looking for them. Anyway, Cerberus, why'd you go back to the hellish ocean?" In reality, it was no coincidence at all. When Charles had summoned Cerberus the last time, he had copied the loyalty symbol from Cerberus onto his own body, knowing that if they met again, Cerberus would instinctively be kind to one who bore the same symbol. "I hope Cerberus can sense the mark," thought Charles, "because I could be in serious trouble if it doesn't." Cerberus didn't explain why it was chasing the soul-devouring rats. Instead, it looked at the ones that had run away and shouted at Charles, "You've stolen my food. Now you have to compensate me." Charles thought for a moment, and then he took out a few fish from his energy storage space and threw them to the 3-headed monster. These were all fish he had caught in a local river. Each fish was at least 3 feet long and full of vitality. "But I won't give it to sturgeon," thought Charles. "If I give it all the good stuff up front, it'll be difficult to satisfy the creature in the future." Cerberus opened its mouth wide and swallowed all 3 fish whole in one great gulp. Then it smiled a satisfied smile. "The food in your human realm is delicious. Compared to the terrible stuff I usually eat, this is a wonderful delicacy." Charles's eyes lit up. The so-called summoning ritual was a means of making a sacrifice in exchange for the service of a hellish creature. But Cerberus doesn't care about that, thought Charles. It just wants more food from our world, because our food is so much better than what it's used to eating. Looking at Cerberus, Charles realized that the creature was embarrassed, opening and closing its mouth, as if trying to find the right words to say. Charles guessed what it was thinking. It wants more food, he thought, but it's too embarrassed to ask for it. The three-headed dog rolled its eyes and looked at the surrounding zombies. It said to Charles, "I know that you have my loyalty mark on your body, and that means the ancient contract decrees that if you give me 5 times the amount of food you gave me just now, no, 10 times that amount, I'll help you deal with these zombies." Charles agreed without hesitation and said, "Okay, it's a deal, but I only need you to help with the zombies who are level 4 or higher. I want to use the rest as a training exercise for my troops." "Deal," agreed Cerberus. Cerberus then spat black flames out of each of its 3 mouths. The black tongues of fire weren't affected by the rainstorm, and they burned a group of zombies to ashes. Cerberus kept on spitting fire from all of its mouths, burning high-level zombies to death one after another, and in less than a minute, it had killed a third of the remaining zombies. "And now," said Cerberus, "you have to keep your side of the ancient contract." Its 6 eyes glared at Charles, shining brightly at the prospect of more delicious food. Charles took the necessary amount of food from his energy storage space with no hesitation and handed it to Cerberus. Then, turning to the Dawn Alliance fighters who had been watching Cerberus very carefully, he gave his order saying, "Kill the rest of the zombies. Finish them off now."